So the quality of employment means different things to different people and also to different institutions. And we have some examples of conceptualizations which include pretty much every aspect of employment that there is. So that means we end up with very long lists of variables that could be included in the concept. And the problem with this is that if you try to measure this, it becomes very complicated. So an indicator with, for example, 40 variables is very difficult to use. So the way I measure quality of employment is I focus on 3 dimensions. The first is income from employment. The second is job stability. So what type of contract you have, for example, how long that contract lasts, how stable your job is, and so on. And then the third dimension brings together other variables that comprise employment conditions. That can be health variables, environmental variables, social security contributions, the number of hours you work. It really depends on which variables are measurable with a particular data source that can be used in any given country. The way you measure the quality of employment is you take these 3 dimensions, and in each dimension you have to define a threshold below which a worker is considered to be deprived. So in the income dimension, for example, that could be a minimum wage level, or it could be a particular number of food baskets, or it could be any level of income that's otherwise defined. Some countries have ethical incomes or fair work. They have different standards, but the important thing is that you define a threshold below which a worker is deprived and above which a worker is not deprived. And then you do the same thing for the other dimensions and the other variables included in those dimensions. So for example, if your variable is social security contributions, then workers who do contribute to social security are considered non-deprived, and workers who do not contribute to social security are considered to be deprived. And the same system goes for every variable included in the indicator. And then at the end, you define a cutoff line for the indicator overall, below which a worker is deprived. So for example, if you're deprived in more than 1/3 of the variables included in the indicator, then a worker would be considered deprived. It's a simple counting method, and it's based on the Alkire-Foster methodology that's also used for measuring multidimensional poverty. Quality employment often, well, it can exist for different reasons. Often in developing countries, it exists because there simply aren't enough jobs to go around. So many workers work informally, work under very precarious conditions, often under conditions that threaten their health or their well-being in some dimension. But it can also result as a consequence of different regulatory changes. So for example, the flexibilization that has been implemented in many countries to make employment relationships more flexible has resulted in a larger number of workers who are working under quite precarious conditions. Those conditions could be, for example, through outsourcing or through short-term contracts or by hiring workers on a temporary contract. Here in the UK, we have something called a 0-hour contract, which is a particularly nasty form of precarious employment relationship. So there can be different regulations, but there can also just simply be a surplus of labor that means that a very large proportion of the labor force is actually working in very precarious conditions. The important thing here is that you measure it, that you derive a consensus that for a particular country defines what is the quality of employment, how do we measure this, and then that you measure it consistently over time so that governments can see whether they're improving and in which dimensions they're improving. So that's the key issue really here, to have a simple indicator that gives you a summary overview of what's going on in a labor market that goes beyond the unemployment rate. So the other key aspect here is that we don't want to be focusing just on unemployment rates, especially not in developing countries, where the unemployment rate often is not that meaningful as an indicator. The problem with precarious jobs and workers who work in precarious employment is that they are not protected. And so, for example, a very simple example is all the workers in developing countries who are working informally, who are self-employed, who don't contribute to social security, they are often not protected by the government or by social security systems in any shape or form. And so it's very difficult for governments to ensure that they can be protected during a crisis such as the current one. What governments have to focus on is very simply anti-poverty measures, cash transfers, basic subsidies, guaranteeing universal basic income. Those are the kind of measures that governments need to take for precarious workers under current conditions. In the case of formal workers who have an employment contract and who work for companies, it's a slightly different picture. And here the most important thing is that companies cut hours, not workers. And this is where governments can help by helping these companies to keep on as many workers, even if this means reducing their hours or even entire days during which they're not working, and then by providing furlough subsidies so that these workers can make enough income to keep afloat. Examples include every time that there's a regulatory change that improves the employment conditions associated with work, there will be a jump and an improvement in the quality of employment. So a simple example is when domestic service work was regulated in Latin America, it produced significant improvements in the quality of employment of domestic workers. So where before they didn't have contracts, now they have contracts. Before they didn't contribute to Social Security, now they contribute to Social Security. Before they worked way too many hours, now the hours have been regulated and limited. So those things really contribute to improving working conditions overall. And it's particularly easy to do when it comes to a particular sector. And the idea that if the sector becomes regulated, there will be fewer employment doesn't necessarily hold. So in a country like Chile, for example, we've seen sustained improvements of the quality of employment over time, even though the participation rate in the labor market has been increasing, and even though some types of work have been disappearing from the labor market. So there are now fewer domestic workers in Chile than there were before, but the ones who are working as domestic workers, for example, are better regulated and have better quality of employment. And the unemployment rate over this period of time has not increased. In fact, it's gone down. Now, of course, everything that I'm saying now applies to the circumstances before the COVID crisis. And the big question mark in Latin America, in other developing countries, in the MENA region, for example, is what will happen as a result of this COVID crisis. And to expect developing countries to deal with this, first of all, it's a very tall order. It requires significant resources that I'm not sure all developing countries have. It requires cash transfers and new forms of protecting employment that so far haven't been thought through. I think the key issue here is what you mentioned in terms of the equal rights that workers have access to. So, for example, if you have two workers who are doing the same job, one is subcontracted, the other is employed by a firm, or one has a fixed term contract and the other one has an open-ended contract, then eliminating the differences between these types of contracts is key to eliminating the precarious jobs. And that can be done in a way that doesn't affect the unemployment rate or make it shoot up. And it can also be done in a way in which is sustainable over time. With informal employment, this is a taller proposition. It's harder to do simply because informal workers aren't captured through ordinary systems of regulation and contracts. So here the key issue is to persuade and incentivize informal workers to start contributing, for example, to social security systems and to start formalizing themselves. And here the government can help very significantly, for example, by transitioning from conditional cash transfer programs to earned income tax credits. So the earned income tax credit actually gives you an incentive to become a formalized worker. Now, having said that, you need a certain degree of institutional capacity and quite a lot of political will to make these kind of changes, because these are very substantial changes to the labor market. These are structural changes, and they require a lot of political will and capital in order to be implemented well. So we have some examples of discussions in this regard in Latin America going on at the moment, but overall, countries in the Latin American region are still working with conditional cash transfer programs, and the discussion about earned income tax credits, for example, has only just begun. Having said that, the Chilean government, for example, has regulated that informal workers should now become formalized by contributing to social security. So that's a first step in the right direction.